Welcome to IPC Masterclass 4. As you know, last year we have started this kind of scientific sessions called IPC Masterclass, which is a trademark brand now. We have done 3 seasons last year, and this year, starting from this month early, we started IPC Masterclass 4.0, what we call. And today we are here for the third session of this series. Welcome to IPC Masterclass 4. Before we start, a couple of things I would like to request all of you to consider while you are joining this course here. Very briefly about the agenda, we have introduction of the topic in speaker by Ramdas, who is the director of Sanmed Healthcare. Sanmed is the sole sponsor of this series this year again. Then we'll have a presentation by our speaker, Dr. Aruna Pujari. After the presentation, if you have any query, any questions, you can ask to the panel, to speaker. She will be able to respond as many questions as possible today. And then I would like to tell you, many people ask that what is the joining link. So for IPC Masterclass series, every time the joining link is same. That is ipcmasterclass.live/join. You can join any Tuesday at 3 o'clock when the session is scheduled in this same link. Of course, we'll have vote of thanks. And last but the most important thing here, I would like to say is that the session is being recorded and it's broadcasted in YouTube. I see many of our international friends also joined in YouTube. And this is also, there is a link also in Facebook as well as in LinkedIn. So people are able to access the session live in LinkedIn and Facebook as well. Your social profile might appear when you comment or you make any kind of questions there. So I want you to be mindful about that. Continuing your participation in this event is the acceptance of this term. A couple of housekeeping announcement that this is in Google Meet, so many of you have access to microphone and video camera. So I request you do not use your mic and camera unless until you have been asked for while asking question. Put your questions in the chat box of Google Meet as well as in the comment box of the YouTube channel. You will not be able to take the questions from Facebook and LinkedIn. So I request all of you to please use the YouTube or Google Meet to ask your questions. You need to log in your social media account to ask your questions. And the questions will be moderated. It's not that all questions will be able to address. I don't think so. About the certificate, the entire series of 5 webinars, you can claim a certificate of participation to be issued by Infection Control Academy of India and the University of Hyderabad jointly. To claim this certificate, you need to attend a quiz which will be open next Tuesday on 29th June. And this quiz will carry questions from all the 4 sessions. You will get even 1 week time to attend your question, your quiz. And then the certificate will be issued for the series, entire series, after July 6th onwards. These are the brief about housekeeping. And as you know, group of eminent speakers in this series who has already spoken and some are yet to come. So I invite at this moment V. Ramdas, Director Sanmed Healthcare, to come live and introduce the topic as well as the speaker, please. Ramdas, please.
Thank you, Pranav. And good afternoon to you, and very good afternoon to you, Dr. Aruna Pujari, for making it happen today. On behalf of Sanmed Healthcare, I extend a warm welcome to all of you and a very good afternoon to all the participants. Right, this is IPC Masterclass Season 4, 4.0. That's what we say. And this is the third session of this particular series of webinar 4. Right, the topic of this being learnings from the past waves to prepare for the next. That's the theme for this, under which there are 4 topics and a panel discussion. So that's the way this is designed. And this is a collaborative effort with Infection Control Academy of India, University of Hyderabad, and Indian Institute of Public Health, IIPH. Generally, the honor of introducing the topic, the presenter, is usually done by Dr. Ranga Reddy, who is the president of Infection Control Academy of India, but today he is not here. He's just recuperating from a minor surgery, which he has undergone last week. He's doing perfectly fine, and I'm hoping that in a couple of days he'll be back to action. So this is IPC Masterclass, which is an initiative by Sanmed Healthcare. This is something, as Pranav said, we started last year, and we have had 3 themes, and this is the 4th one. And each of these themes, under which we had at least 4 to 5 sessions on this. Right, we started with outbreaks, epidemics and pandemics. It was more to do with the epidemiological study, and we had 5 sessions on that. Then we had biosafety, which was a very important topic, and then under which we had almost 5 sessions. And then occupational safety in pandemics, we thought was a very important topic, because last year we were going through the first wave, and I think we said that it's important that the healthcare professionals know about what are the safety procedures and how they should do it. And this year, we said we are just going through the second wave. Some says the third wave has already begun, but I think we were going through the second wave, and we said that there has been a lot of learning, because every day is a new learning in this particular pandemic. So whatever latest are available, how can we make it useful for the healthcare professionals? So hence we said that we will go with this theme of learnings from the past waves to prepare for the next. We have had 2 sessions, one by Dr. GVS Murthy and Dr. Anup Warrior, and today we have the session with Dr. Aruna Pujari. Right, I'm sure Dr. Aruna Pujari doesn't need any introduction, right? Now, can I have the next slide? Right, she's the head of the department of pathology and microbiology at Breach Candy Hospital Trust, Mumbai, and she is going to talk on co-infections and secondary infections in COVID-19 patients. Who and what may be responsible? What an important topic it is. We are talking about a lot of co-infections and the secondary infections going around now, and everyone is scared about what's happening. And Dr. Aruna Pujari is going to throw light on that, and I'm sure all of us will be richly benefited out of that. Dr. Aruna Pujari she has done her MD in microbiology, and has numerous publications, book chapters, guest lectures, right? 38 odd international and national peer-reviewed publications. She's written chapters in 2 of the books. She has had more than 100 odd guest lectures for various academic, medical societies. And she's a teacher. She teaches postgrad to the students of postgraduate DNB in microbiology. She, is a lecturer in the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and diploma in pathology and bacteriology. She is also a teacher for FCPS, medicine and tropical diseases. She's a PG teacher for MSc microbiology research at Mumbai University. And her interest obviously is about hospital infection control, quality management in the lab, and teaching. So I'm sure we will have a wonderful listening. Last year also, she was kind enough to be part of one of our, webinar series. And thank you, Dr. Aruna. I think we look forward for your presentation and learnings from you. Over to Dr. Aruna Pujari.
Thank you, Mr. Ramdas. Dr. Ranga, I hope you get well soon, and we'll see you in the next session. And Mr. Pranav, I'm now sharing my screen, and very good afternoon to everyone here. The topic given to me today is co-infections and secondary infections in COVID-19 patients. Who and what may be responsible? And I think this is a really interesting topic. Because both of these are different entities, and the first and foremost thing that we need to ensure is that we are aware what these two entities are all about. So this is going to be the overview of my talk. We'll have one slide on the pandemic, a definition of co-infection and superinfection as per CDC, the immune insult that COVID causes, is what we'll see, the literature review for co-infections, what is the significance of co-infections, and similarly for superinfections. We look at some good lab diagnostic tools to help us identify these early. And finally, prevention of these infections is something which is very, very important. So severe acute respiratory syndrome related coronavirus 2, which is now called as SARS-CoV-2, is basically the virus that causes the COVID-19 disease. And all of us already know about all of these things that I'm saying. It belongs to the family Coronaviridae, is a single-stranded RNA virus. Because it has 80% similarity to SARS-CoV-1, it was labeled as SARS-CoV-2. And while it spreads through droplets, fomites, and airborne, there's always been a controversy about airborne, and less and less with fomites as we've moved out of the year, more than a year into the pandemic. With an incubation period of about 5 days, its clinical presentation could be mild, moderate, and severe. And over a period of time, there have been multiple modalities of therapy, and I believe no antimicrobial agent has been left to be used when it comes to SARS-CoV-2, whether they are antiparasitic agents, of course, antivirals, antibacterials, everything have been tried. And the good thing is vaccination is in place. Though slow, we are now vaccinating different populations excepting children. And despite all of this, we've seen every country in this world probably has seen 2 waves, and variants of concerns keep on coming, and India is particularly facing the Delta 2 variant now, or it's going to be coming. So, while all of these continue, we are going to today discuss about a different problem that exists or coexists along with. So we now discuss 2 important problems that we see side by side as we manage patients of COVID. So the first one is co-infection. Co-infection, as defined by the CDC, is the recovery of other respiratory pathogens in patients with SARS-CoV-2 infection at the time of the SARS-CoV-2 infection diagnosis. Okay, and then there are superinfections, which are basically subsequent recovery of other respiratory pathogens during the care of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And these are both separate entities that we see, and we need to distinguish between them, and we need to manage them separately. Now, with COVID, we have seen that there is a lot of immune dysregulation that happens, and as a result of which people are predisposed to a variety of infections. And as you see in this particular paper, they very beautifully identified all the problems that happen with the immune system, both to the innate as well as to the acquired immunity. And right from your frontline cells like your monocytes, macrophages, dendritic cells, natural killer cells, almost everything is affected, to your CD4 and CD8 cells being lowered in function, a lot of pro-inflammatory cytokines being produced, which in turn led us to use of corticosteroids and IL-6 inhibitors in order to reduce the damage that could be produced by a cytokine storm. And unfortunately, these immunomodulatory agents also have their own immunosuppressive effects on neutrophils, monocytes, macrophages, and the various other cytokine responses. So this particular paper looked into the incidence of co-infections and superinfections in hospitalized patients. And as you see here, for co-infections, they found that chronic renal disease is an important factor in patients of CKD. it is likely that these patients might present with additional respiratory pathogens. Whereas when it comes to hospital-acquired infections, the significant risk factors were the use of tocilizumab and corticosteroids, along with a prolonged length of stay and ICU admission. And all these are very, these are pretty obvious, because naturally all of this predisposes the patient to opportunistic pathogens, and an environment where there might these pathogens might be already present, making increasing the risk. Another study which looked at the outcomes and the prevalence of co-infection and super-infection. This was a systematic review, a recently published study. And what did they find? They found that in co-infections, the bacteria are about 8%, whereas in super-infections, they're about 20%. Viruses about 10%, whereas in super-infections, they're only about 4%. Whereas fungi are 4% in co-infection and almost 8% in super-infections. Overall, they said that presence of any co-infection, meaning any infection, whether it be super-infection or co-infection, increases the morbidity as well as the mortality in patients who are patients suffering from COVID-19 disease. Now let's look into further details of co-infections in COVID-19. And this was one of the papers from last year, which identified different kinds of organisms that were causing co-infections, which included a whole lot of respiratory viruses. Then there were fungi, there were also a whole lot of bacteria, and all of these would naturally, because they were co-infections, would influence the immune system and further release of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and could increase the morbidity as well as mortality. This is a study which looked at Mycoplasma pneumoniae as a co-infection, and they found about out of 580 patients, they found about 8 patients who were infected with Mycoplasma pneumoniae. So this is an important consideration that one must keep in mind when evaluating co-infections due to SARS-CoV-2. Another meta-analysis published, this was published somewhere in the month of May of 2020, as early as that, and it indicated that bacterial infections could be anywhere between 0 to 45%, viral could be 0 to 25%, and fungal could be 0 to 7% of these co-infections along with SARS-CoV-2 disease. They also noted that at that time, that was almost about a year ago, that there were lower number of common pathogens like Streptococcus pneumoniae, Staph pyogenes, and Staph aureus in the COVID-19 pandemic versus the influenza epidemics. And they suggested that it was important to stop empiric antimicrobial agents unless a pathogen had been identified. So if a pathogen was, if a co-pathogen was not there, then that was a chance to actually stop empiric antimicrobial therapy if it had been started. This is a more recent study, and as you see here, with more data being gathered, we see an increase in number of Staph aureus and Streptococcus pneumoniae and Haemophilus influenzae, similar to the flu epidemics that we encounter. And our own data, many a times we've had a lot of respiratory syndromic evaluation that we've done, and we've had about eight different types of viruses that we've seen. We've not had any mycoplasma over here, and a couple of fungi, mostly in patients who were in fact affected with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So the significance of diagnosing any of these co-infections would be, in this pandemic, we have a very low degree of suspicion. Everyone thinks about SARS-CoV-2 and is not going to really think about other co-infections, particularly of the respiratory tract, because they have a very similar clinical presentation. Labs also, we are all focused on the pandemic bug, so we don't really think about other co-infections, similar to our clinical colleagues many a times. There is widespread non-availability of syndromic approach tests which incorporate COVID-19. Fortunately, there is one available now, and I'm sure in future more will be available. And this increases the risk of morbidity and mortality, and also increases the risk of using broad spectrum antimicrobials, further driving antimicrobial resistance in the amongst the bacteria that we encounter. So it's very important that we identify co-infections. and accordingly treat them, keep a high degree of suspicion even if we are in the pandemic, and accordingly manage these co-infections. Now, moving on to superinfections, and we know that superinfections, the important reasons for the superinfection is basically immune dysfunction, which is not only because of the disease, but also because of the kind of therapy that we use, be it high dose of steroids, be it IL-6 inhibitors, and be it the many antimicrobial agents that we use empirically, leading to breakthrough infections. And also because a lot of invasive devices can be used, particularly in the critical cohort. So these super infections naturally would increase morbidity, mortality, length of stay, cost of therapy, and I think an excellent example is the mucormycosis that we are seeing now. They need to be debrided, meaning surgical debridement needs to be done so many number of times till we can achieve cure that really increases the cost of therapy. We see a lot of breakthrough infections. Many of these are actually breakthrough infections, and the increase and prolonged use of broad spectrum antimicrobial agents, and naturally the pressure of antimicrobial agents further pushes us into super infections which are actually resistant to these. For example, the risk for mucormycosis, use of voriconazole is a risk factor. For example, if you isolate Stenotrophomonas maltophilia from a respiratory specimen, and the patient has been on carbapenems, then that's another risk factor for this bacteria to be isolated. So super infections can further be classified as bacterial, fungal, viral, and parasitic, and we are going to look at each of these. So coming to bacterial infections, basically bacterial infections which are hospital acquired, as you see in this particular paper. Again, this has Europe, Asia, as well as the US. And as you see, bloodstream infections and respiratory infections are common. Coagulase negative staph seems to be the predominant bloodstream isolate, followed by Enterococcus, which is quite surprising and makes me think whether the gut is involved and some kind of translocation in the gut is involved. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Staph aureus, as well as Klebsiella. Whereas in the respiratory tract, it's basically Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Klebsiella, Staph aureus, and the other Enterobacterales. So it clearly indicates that these are the two most common hospital-acquired infections that we see. Another study published in Open Forum of Infectious Diseases more recently, which looked at post-mortem studies for bacterial superinfections, and this was again a review with 621 patients from 75 studies being included, and they found that pneumonia was the most common infection that was present, followed by abscesses and empyema and septic emboli. And these lung superinfections were the cause of 16% mortality in potential cases and 3% of all the COVID-19 disease. And again, look at the organisms that you see here, mainly Acinetobacter, Staph aureus, Pseudomonas, and the others. So some of these organisms are important drivers of infections, and they can lead to mortality. This is a good study that has come out actually from India, 10 tertiary care institutions here in India with almost 17,500 patients, and they said 56.7% of these patients actually developed secondary infections and had 10.6% mortality. And once again, see here, these are the most common bugs: Klebsiella, Acinetobacter, and Pseudomonas. Somehow, Acinetobacter has really come up as a very important pathogen during this particular COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, for us, we did not have Acinetobacter as an important pathogen in our ICU, and with the COVID ICU, it has become the #1 pathogen. The same study looks at the various different types of infections, and they find that bloodstream infections are most common, followed by respiratory tract infections, and followed by urinary tract infections. And almost 74% of these isolates were actually carbapenem resistant, which is very, very alarming, which means that these are all XDR pathogens. Our own study, meaning our own little data coming from the last 1 year, again indicates something which is very similar to the study that I previously projected. They're all pneumonias with secondary BSIs or simply pneumonias, and followed by central line associated BSI. So we've seen a lot of different kinds of infections in COVID-19 patients, which are all healthcare associated infections. And as you see here, I mentioned about Acinetobacter baumannii being an important pathogen to us. Stenotrophomonas and Elizabeth meningoseptica were never our ICU pathogens, and suddenly they've cropped up, and they've become very important organisms in our COVID ICU. So, Acinetobacter baumannii, Stenotrophomonas maltophilia, Elizabeth kingia, meningoseptica, and Klebsiella remain the important gram-negative bugs in our COVID ICU. So that was about bacterial infections, and we now move on to fungal super infections, and there are all different new terminologies coming up with the fungal super infections that are associated with COVID. So you have COVID-associated candidiasis, you have COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis, you have COVID-associated mucormycosis, and a whole lot of other yeasts that come up as super infections. And naturally, some community bugs which are true opportunists. For example, Pneumocystis xyrovisi is also one of them. For COVID-associated candidiasis, apart from the common risk factors that you would have as was present even during the pre-COVID era, like diabetes, renal failure, hemodialysis, multiple catheters, parenteral nutrition, abdominal surgery, multiple antibiotics, more than 7 days in the ICU and prior abdominal infection. Certain specific COVID-19 related risk factors are use of extracorporeal membrane therapies, that is the ECMO, corticosteroid therapy, and the severe damage that that the SARS-CoV-2 virus causes to the alveolar epithelium. So these are some of the important risk factors, and we see invasive candidiasis certainly in the COVID ICU. Our own data shows that Candida auris is predominant, and there's been concern raised over the presence of Candida auris not only here in India but also abroad. Overall, as you see here, they are mostly non-albicans Candida that one would see as part of the invasive candidiasis. Moving on to mucor, and this has again gained a lot of importance. In fact, it is a notifiable disease now, and there are at least 3 important studies that have come from India, 2 systematic reviews, and one multi-center epidemiology study to understand mucormycosis in the COVID setting much better. And this particular study from which was a systematic review of cases reported worldwide and in India, showed that most of these patients were males, and they had either active disease or they were recovered. Pre-existing diabetes mellitus was seen in almost about 80% of the patients. Some of them presented with diabetic ketoacidosis. Corticosteroid intake was recorded in almost 76% of the cases. So most important issues to be dealt here with are the appropriate use of corticosteroid therapy, avoid unnecessary use of corticosteroids. Second is, if a patient is diabetic, control the diabetes, whether he was a previous diabetic or he has become diabetic now because of the therapy that we have given. Controlling blood sugars is a very, very important aspect of trying to prevent mucormycosis in this COVID-associated mucormycosis that we have seen. Now next, coming to COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis, and again here there are almost 3 systematic reviews, and this one particular systematic review published in Journal of Infection recently looked at 1,421 COVID-19 patients and comprising of 19 observational studies, and they found that the incidence of kappa was around 13.5%, with most of these patients requiring invasive mechanical ventilation. The time of kappa diagnosis from the illness onset was somewhere around 8 days to 16 days. A total of 77.6% of these patients had positive lower respiratory cultures. Fungal biomarkers like BAL as well as serum galactomannan were positive in about 45.3 and 18.2% of patients. Mortality was almost 48%, and this was almost similar, about 48 to 50% in the other 2 systematic reviews also that have been published. Length of hospital as well as the ICU stay was anywhere between 16 to 37 days and 10.5 to 37 days. So automatically the length of stay seems to increase. And these patients were also on prolonged mechanical ventilation. So everything could become actually a vicious cycle. Despite being on antifungal agents, these patients, 48% of the patients died. So now that's another very important fungal superinfection that we see in case of COVID-19 disease. Now coming to rarer fungi that have been reported, this is a bloodstream infection because of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and here there are 2 patients described, and both of these patients were given steroids, and they were given probiotics. So when in this setting of an immunocompromised status, using probiotics should be with a lot of care, just similar to how we use basically corticosteroids or immunomodulators. You have to be very careful and cautious when using any kind of live organisms here. Other opportunistic fungi like histoplasma and cryptococcosis have also been described. Trichospora asahi is also another super infection that has been described. Here there are 5 cases of Trichospora asahi fungemia, and all of them received steroids, all of them received broad spectrum antimicrobial agents. Some of them were breakthrough infections. All of them received steroids and tocilizumab, and of the 5, 4 were dead. So it's a very important pathogen that needs to be identified, and laboratories should have capacity to identify Trichosporon, at least species, because it's very simple. Once you have seen the growth, you will really never forget it. Similarly, when it comes to yeast, we almost never report lung infections because of yeast, because especially the candida and the other opportunistic yeast. Of course, histoplasma and cryptococcus are pathogens of the lung, but the other ones we always hesitate to report them unless it has been proved with a lung biopsy. And there is a case of nosocomial pneumonia because of Trichospora asahi, along with 2 other bacteria, that is Pseudomonas aeruginosa and Stenotrophomonas maltophilia, which was proven with a lung biopsy, and ultimately the patient passed away on the 38th day of his admission. So anything seems to be possible in case of COVID-19, particularly in a critically ill patient. So keep your mind and your eyes open, is what I would like to say. Our own experience with Trichosporon super infections have been that we have 2 patients with BSIs and 1 patient with cavitatory lung disease. These patients did receive, 2 of these patients with the BSI received tocilizumab. We do not have history for the 3rd patient because he was referred from another place. Both the BSIs received corticosteroids also, and unfortunately all 3 of them were dead. So it's a very important super infection that needs to be kept in mind. So this is a study that looked at predictors of hospital-acquired bacterial and fungal super infections, and it looked at the variety of the kind of infections that could be caused by these 2 super infections. And as you see, bacteremia and fungemia seem to be the predominant one, followed by pneumonias, followed by urinary tract infections, HAPs, SSIs, and intra-abdominal infections. And as you see here, MDRs predominate, and non-fermenting GNBs like your Acinetobacter, Stenotrophomonas maltophilia, Physiobacterium, Elizabethinia, all of these tend to come after day 8, further suggesting that these are all environmental bugs that get that are caught from the ICU environment. Similarly, mixed flora also seems to increase, and the fungi also have their own fair share. And according to this study, the important predictors were intestinal colonization by carbapenem-resistant bacteria, invasive mechanical ventilation, and the use of IL-6 inhibitors or JAK inhibitors were 3 most important predictors for that were independently associated with super infections. Also CRP and the use of piperacillin tazobactam. So these are the various predictors, and one needs to be watchful when these are present. to pick up infections in our patients, we need to be very watchful and intervene early. With bacteria and fungi, we now move on to viruses, and this was an interesting study from Italy, in fact, and they looked at the EBV DNA increase in COVID-19 patients who had an impaired lymphocyte subpopulation count. And what they looked at their ICU patients and their sub-ICU patients, numbers of 42 and 61. And while they didn't only look at EBV DNA, but also looked at CMV, parvovirus B19, and HHV6, but they only found EBV in this subset of population, with 95% of their ICU population having EBV DNA in their blood, and the sub-ICU had almost about 83%. And they also correlated that this was shown along with a decrease in their CD8 or the cytotoxic T cells and their natural killer cell counts. So they indicated a correlation between increase in EBV DNA and therefore reactivation, mainly because of the immune suppression or the cytotoxic T cells and the natural killer cells being reduced. There are other studies and other newspaper cutouts which seem to have come in with other viruses as well. In fact, one of our dermatologists reported a herpes simplex virus ulceration in the buttocks of a patient, and again there was CMV virus associated colitis that has also been presented at the chest annual meeting. So a whole lot of viruses which are opportunistic and which can reactivate because of the immune dysfunction in COVID need to be kept in mind, and consider them as a high degree of suspicion whenever you have the appropriate patient. With that, we now move on to the parasitic infections, and here are two reports of Strongyloides stercoralis, one of GI infection, the other one with pneumonia. Both of these patients had severe illness. They were on high-dose steroids and they had also received tocilizumab. Both these patients presented with eosinophilia and new onset fever. The patient also had diarrhea. So a stool exam showed rhabditiform larvae of Strongyloides stercoralis, whereas in the second patient, this patient had a disseminated disease. And when his sputum sample came to the microbiology laboratory, this is what, after incubation along with the gram negatives, there were these serpentinous tracks that were seen. And when a wet mount of this sputum sample was done, the larvae of Strongyloides were observed. This is something which is very, very important for us microbiologists. We normally see such serpentinous tracks if we keep the plates outside at room temperature for a few days, and we see maggots forming these tracking lines. But please remember that if your plate comes out of the incubator the next day and you see these tracking lines, think about larvae of Strongyloides stercoralis, ask for additional specimens, and do a wet mount to see if they are present. So that was an important clue from which was, these investigators picked up by chance. But this is again another opportunistic pathogen that again comes up because of the immune suppression that we see with COVID-19 severe illness. The laboratory diagnosis of these super infections is something which is very important. Always a high degree of suspicion would help. Send as many site-specific cultures as one can. Send multiple sets of blood cultures. If you have lines, then different lines should be used to send appropriate volumes of blood cultures. Perform stained as well as unstained preparations. Calcofluor mount, KOH, these are all become very important. Make use of the antigens that are available, whether it is the cryptococcal antigen, whether it's galactomannan or beta-D-glucan. And multiplex PCRs, which are based upon syndromic approach, are also available in the market, though they do not have a widespread reach, but wherever they are available, they should be used because they would help not only in identifying the pathogen, but would do that early in a couple of hours. And many a times they might also be able to identify certain gene mechanisms of resistance, particularly in gram-negative bacteria, which would allow you to tailor-make therapy and reduce the broad spectrum coverage that one normally tends to give with empiric therapy. There are also tests that are available which could identify further the genes that may be responsible for carbapenem resistance. So overall, try to use whatever laboratory support that can be gathered, and particularly when it comes to fungi, we would prefer that instead of sending swabs, please send tissue samples and for cultures, because it would allow us to identify and culture the organisms much better. So finally, coming to prevention of these super infections, and this is a very, very important part. First and foremost would be to appropriately use immunomodulatory therapy. So we've seen that there has been absolute abuse on the use of corticosteroids. Even patients who are having mild disease were given corticosteroids, and most of the cases of mucormycosis that we have seen in the Indian population have actually been those ones who were treated on OPD basis, which are mild cases, and post 3 weeks or 4 weeks into post the illness, they have landed up with the features of mucormycosis. So use of immunomodulatory therapy should be really with a lot of caution. Strict adherence to antimicrobial stewardship basics. So if you don't find a pathogen, de-escalate. If you identify a pathogen, make every attempt to try and identify it to as specifics as is possible. If there is a gram negative, if you can identify gene mechanisms, there again you would be able to tailor-make therapy. Avoid multiple different drugs to cover, broadly every pathogen that might be there. Understand your local pathogens and their antibiograms within the COVID ICUs, and then go by your basic stewardship practices. Strict adherence to asepsis when caring for invasive devices. Again, most of these super infections happen actually in patients who are in the ICU, and the COVID ICU is far, far different from the normal ICU that we had. All healthcare workers are in personal protective equipment. Gloves are being used universally, and this universal use of gloves has actually made healthcare workers forget, I feel, hand hygiene. Many a times they just seem to forget hand hygiene, and particularly when caring for invasive devices or manipulating invasive devices, one must ensure that even on gloved hands you can do hand hygiene, and that's the new normal when it comes to doing hand hygiene in these areas. So caring of invasive devices with proper aseptic conditions is an absolute must. Again, strengthening hand hygiene, especially moment 5, and moment 5 is basically the environment of the patient. As you see, we saw that a lot of opportunists from the environment seem to be causing super infections, and all of these can gain access into the patient only and only if the interface, that is the healthcare worker, is not careful about how the healthcare worker handles the environment and the patient. So if moment 5 is done well, the organisms will not get transferred onto our patients. Improving environmental disinfection strategies. So again, with so many with immunocompromised patients being around, the environmental disinfection probably needs to be increased in frequency. One might be able to switch over agents to better agents, like WHO has recommended hydrogen peroxide or sodium hypochlorite for such situations. So improve the number of times environmental disinfection is being done. Dedicate people, train them, and supervise them so that it is done correctly. And finally, appropriate use of diagnostics, because these days diagnostics are available. Laboratory can support you in helping to both prevent, control, diagnose super infections. So finally, this is to conclude. Immune dysregulation is the hallmark of COVID-19, both moderate as well as severe disease. A very high degree of suspicion and early detection for co-infections would help in reducing morbidity and mortality, along with pressure on antimicrobial agents. Super infections are an important cause of mortality in COVID-19. and they could be prevented by the appropriate use of immunomodulatory agents, strict adherence to IT and AMS protocols, and rapid diagnostics would greatly help in managing superinfection. And I would say less done the better, especially with a lot of abuse to the mild category of patients. I think we really didn't need to do anything. We just sit back and allow the virus to get over, excepting for the high risk patients. So I firmly believe less done the better in the COVID scenario. So thank you very much, and that's my whole team who supports me to be whatever I am. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It was a really interesting, very informative presentation. And we have a couple of questions here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask the people, the participant itself, to ask the question directly. So I see Dr. Dilip Kumar Mishra, who has given a very interesting actually case, and he's asking the question based on that. So I request Dr. Dilip, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions directly to speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, madam.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Dilip.
Yes.
Actually, this case is a young female, 17 years, admitted 2 weeks ago with features of respiratory problem and with left-sided hemiplegia. Then we ruled out, we did the CSF study on the day 1. It was actually aseptic, no cells were found. It was clear with mild raised pressure and normal glucose and proteins. Then Indian in preparation of CSF was negative, and CSF crag is also negative. But by the time we sent also COVID-19, we took 2 days time to get the COVID report, and she was in ICU actually initially with the respiratory support and all. Then we managed as a case of pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia with stroke or possible meningitis. Then cryptococcal antigen serum was positive. She is actually immunocompetent. HIV was negative and very young child. Then cryptococcal antigen outside also it was positive, and they have given amphotericin B before coming to our hospital for 3-4 days. Then they said she developed some side effects, complications. Then I stopped amphotericin B and treated as bacterial meningitis. Then after 2 days, I got COVID-19. It was positive, but with the treatment, I started like meropenem, 2 gram TDS. Then that is the antibiotic I started. With D-dimer was high, so we have given some Clexane also. And her blood pressure was also high due to maybe we have started some steroids because of respiratory distress initially a few days. 4 or 5 days I have given also steroids. She recovered. She is out of oxygen support. Then after 7 to 10 days of antibiotics, she recovered very well. Again, I repeated after 1 week the CSF, same, it was clear, sterile, cryptococcal antigen was negative, Indian INC was also negative. So then I found I could not see what the literatures for the serum crag was positive even that time. So I just put her on fluconazole 400 milligram and discharged her. She is still okay, but she has the deficit of left side hemiplegia. I was just thinking what might be the cause of cryptococcal antigen in serum, and though CSF was normal.
So very interesting case actually, Dr. Mishra, and I'm sure this is not really easy to treat, and so many laboratory reports come in and they further confuse the scenarios. And even I wonder why the serum crag should be positive and the CSF is negative if there was CNS meningitis, CNS infection with cryptococcosis. Now, we must also remember that cryptococcal, the primary site of infection is actually the lung, and from there it disseminates. So many of us actually inhale. It's there, meaning in the environment, many of us inhale. But we've also seen immunocompetent individuals. There's a subset of individuals where even they are immunocompetent and yet land up with either skin lesions, lung, or even CNS infections. So
yes,
maybe something to do with that, and it has probably not reached the CNS. there's a possibility that the hemiplegia and the cryptococcal antigen are not related. It could also be because of other coagulation issues that might be there with the patient because of COVID itself. That could also be there. I may be wrong actually, but this is not an easy case to handle. My suggestion would be definitely go ahead and do if you've already started on fluconazole, give it for an appropriate duration of time. Check the serum cryptococcal antigen levels maybe after about a few weeks and
Okay.
see whether it is reducing, because that would be important. I am not sure of situations where it could come false positive. Frankly, I will need to look at that. I am not sure about it. But at this point in time, it is good to take it. It's a very good test, and one should take it as important. And then since you already started treatment, it has prognostic value. So when they let them
See,
do
okay.
dilution.
Clinically, she improved actually.
Good.
She was not able to eat food. Then she, after 1 week of antibiotics, she recovered. Then she has afebrile, her saturation, everything improved. Then I just discharged. I discussed with our neurologist, one of my peer group neurologist. He also suggested it could be not related to cryptococcal meningitis, maybe somewhere else. So no point of giving amphotericin B at this time. But you treat as meningitis, maybe young stroke, we can think that the
What was the
possibility.
dilution in which it was positive?
Dilution level, ma'am. It
Yes.
was, okay, I can share it.
Check that
I,
and probably check that, and in future, whenever you do, ask them to do the dilution because it has prognostic significance.
okay, ma'am. Dilution level, I'll check.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we have next question from Dr. Ramesh. You are there, Dr. Ramesh, and then we move to Dr. Soumya Singh. If Dr. Ramesh is here,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I'm here.
please ask your question.
Yeah, ma'am, actually, wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask one question. So, what is the treatment option for the COVID-19 patients who got infected with pan-drug resistant bacteria? The sense resistant to carbapenem, colistin, penicillin.
So pan-drug resistant organisms are a reality for us today. That is the reason why I said use molecular techniques. Identify if you have genes like OXA48 or MDMs, which might be there, and that would allow you to use certain other drugs that are now available in our country. And maybe that could be used, or you will be left with using the same cocktail of antimicrobial agents with different dosage and different probably ways of administering. For example, giving a prolonged infusion for 3 hours and things like that. So you'll have to juggle around with whatever is there. But best way to do would be try and identify if any particular gene is available, and if the gene is there, one can juggle around with antimicrobial agents.
Have you ever come across this kind of patients?
Sorry.
So, have you ever experienced this kind of patients?
Of course, in the critical unit, I think, meaning even pre-COVID era, we had trouble with pan-resistant organisms. Many a times they can actually be colonizers. So that's one thing that you need to keep in mind. If your organisms are colonizers, if you're sending urine specimen from a catheterized patient who's been there catheterized for 20 days, or if you're sending a specimen from a drain which is there for maybe 5 or 6 days, and these are the cultures that grow your pan-drug resistant organism. Act with caution, because they can just be simply colonizers, and you can't treat colonizers. Of course, if you have a bloodstream infection with such organisms, then definitely one needs to pay more attention to them, and needs to do other antimicrobial agents. One could test for polymyxin B, one could test for fosfomycin, ceftazidime-avibactam, azithromycin, synergy. So these are the other salvage measures that one could do if you are facing such bugs. But they have been there even during the pre-COVID times.
Thank you, Dr. Arna. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, Dr. Soumya Singh, are you there? You can ask your question.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, it was very good presentation of yours.
Thank
Good
you.
afternoon. Ma'am, actually, we had 2 cases of post-COVID-19. Ma'am, the ENT specialist, they were suspecting some black nasal crusts, and we had done the KOH, and in KOH it was proper, the fungus was of order mucrales. But in culture, ma'am, it turned out to be negative. Ma'am, what could be the reason? Because nasal swabs and the tissue as well, both they have sent. But in culture, it turned out to be positive, ma'am. And here, ma'am, in our state, amphotericin B is only, as per the government rules, it is being issued if the culture is positive. So, ma'am, in that condition, what to do, ma'am? Repeatedly, I have asked for the samples also, but in both the culture, it turned out to be negative.
So one thing, Dr. Soumya, is that it is always good to have tissue bits, meaning whatever nasal crust, tissue bits are more important than swab. In fact, today itself, I spoke to one of my consultants and informed him that don't send us swabs because they seem to come positive on calcofluor, and then, on culture, we don't get anything. So that's dismal. It doesn't help the patient waste money. It doesn't help the clinician, and certainly does not help us because we feel very, meaning agitated at such situations, So encourage your clinicians to send tissue samples more than swab samples. Incubate for a little longer time. Recently, we started actually, dextrose agar is never a primary medium for, actually, for any of these fungi. But we started inoculating that also as a primary medium, simply in the, in trying to get these fungi to grow probably a little earlier. So these are the two mechanisms that can be used to improve your isolation. But I agree, what you see may not always be grown. Another important point here could be if the patient has already taken some kind of therapy. So meaning that would.
Patient was on antibiotics only. No antifungal was being given.
Okay. So I think you will still have to just simply try waiting, incubating, because otherwise mucorals grow very, very quickly. But ask for more samples.
Okay, ma'am. And ma'am, there is another one more question. Actually, in one patient, we have reported as aseptic hyphae was being seen. But ma'am, after a week, they have sent for histopathology. They have also reported the fungal etiology. But ma'am, after a week, when we again got the KOH, we are finding now Candida. So ma'am, what could be the reason? Because mucorales, no site, because in first of our finding, we have given ki aseptate branching and 90-degree angulation order of mucorales. But after a week, we are getting Candida only on KOH also and on culture also. Ma'am, then in that condition, it's really very difficult to report.
A lot of times, once intervention has been done naturally, right, surgical management is a cornerstone of, these patients. So they would have undergone surgical debridement, and once that is done, those areas can be colonized. We are seeing a lot of XDR pathogens coming as colonization in those areas also. So similarly, you could also have Candida. Now, whether that is a pathogen or not would depend upon your patient. We don't report all the Klebsiella and Acinetobacter that we grow from such, frequent swabs that we get in from these debrided areas. But in patients where there might be fever, for example, we had a patient who had a high-grade fever for 2 days, and we grew Acinetobacter there, and he was a case of mucormycosis being treated. So we actually treated that patient with an antimicrobial agent, and his fever went away. So you'll have to be very, very cautious. Ultimately, it is the clinical history of the patient that's very, very important. We are not treating reports. We are treating the patient ultimately. So we need to support our clinical teams with whatever we can do.
Yes, ma'am.
So colonization need not really be reported.
Okay, ma'am. Thank
Now,
you.
though we have reached 4 o'clock, but still, if you permit, Dr. Aruna, we can take 2 questions. We have 3 more questions.
Sure. No problem, Mr.
Okay. So I request Dr. Balaji Birajdar to ask the next question, and then after that, we'll ask Dr. Bhavna Vishnu to ask your question, please. Balaji Birajdar.
Dr. Aruna, thank you so much for this very excellent and very informative lecture. I just have one question regarding this beta-D-glucan and galactomannan in the diagnosis of mucormycosis. So how sensitive and specific they are for mucormycosis diagnosis?
So unfortunately, Balaji, mucormycosis has nothing to do with serum galactomannan and beta-D-glucan. In fact, beta-D-glucan is BDG is an agent that would come positive for aspergillosis and yeasts, and galactomannan is specific for aspergillosis. And both of them have nothing to do with mucormycosis. They are not. If your BDG and your galactomannan are negative, and you have cavitatory disease, or if you have you're suspecting a fungal infection, then probably that being negative, you should also be thinking about mucor. Otherwise, they don't come positive. And pneumocystis xyrovicis and other fungus where BDG could be positive. So in mucor, you will have BDG and galactomannan negative.
Okay. So the ultimate gold standard is the culture only for the mucormycosis. For
mucor, it's absolutely culture. I wouldn't even rely on the various PCRs that are being marketed now. Please don't, waste time and money on the PCR, unless, of course, you send it from a sterile site. Ultimately, what's very, very important is to be able to culture the organism, because that viability of the organism is important. We get a lot of cultures where, we see it on microscopy and we are not able to grow it even after, incubating it for 14 days. Again, suggesting that, these patients have already undergone a debridement, are on antifungal therapy. So the organisms might actually be non-viable. So, it has its own significance. I hate to say that it's very delayed, but it has its own role to play.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Aruna.
Thank you, Balaji.
Dr. Bhavana, please. Dr. Bhavana.
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the excellent talk. Ma'am, we had a COVID patient where he came with respiratory distress and his SpO2 was below 90, and his sputum was sent for culture, and he had a septate hyphae, and his sputum grew aspergillus fumigated. And he was given voriconazole for the IV for a few days. That is, for 5 days he was given in ICU, and he became better within a few days, within 5 days. And because he was symptomatically better, and the clinician didn't want to keep him much more days in the ICU, he was kept in the step-down ICU, and subsequently he went back home. So he was not given appropriately of subsequent voriconazole. So will we not come back with an post-sequelae, post-COVID sequelae without a proper 21 days voriconazole?
So I think this was a co-infection. It's meaning many a times we get aspergillus in sputum cultures. Many a times would come with, not in normal patients, but patients who have some kind of structural lung problems and so on. When previous history of maybe asthma, COPD, and those kinds of things. Now, in such situations, just isolating the fungus is not going to be, the most important thing. And in the pre-COVID era, we used to isolate aspergillus in this set of patients. Okay, many a times it would be colonizers. So once again, I would say that appropriate biomarkers would help to, because if they are really invasive, the only invasive aspergillosis is to be treated. Aspergillus can remain as a colonizer in the particularly in the tracheobronchial tree, can be present, especially when it's cold.
No, ma'am. When she came,
then naturally one would think about treating it with the correct drugs. Voriconazole is helping use, and the appropriate duration of therapy. So. This is a very dicey situation, but yet I think I would leave it to the clinician to decide whether or not it's really an important pathogen in this scenario. But as a co-infection, I think one again needs to tread with caution and care. It could be a colonizer as well.
Yes, ma'am. But when he was admitted, he was very bad, and he was in a critical situation. And they were suspecting some fungal infection. That's why he was sent sputum for fungal infection. and
Okay.
we identified.
So then in that kind of a situation, if you've grown aspergillus, then it's important to treat for the appropriate duration. If you treat less, then naturally there could be problems.
Okay, so once the threat is over, then we can change it from IV to oral for 21 days. That will be ideal, no, ma'am?
One can do it depending upon the clinical status of the patient.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aruna Pujari, and I request Ramdas to come forward and conclude this session.
Yeah,
today.
thank you, Dr. Aruna. It was a wonderful presentation as usual, and I think the best part is we have had a lot of interactive session today. I think almost 15-20 minutes was good thought of that, Pranav. I think overall, I think the attendance was also very good. We are quite happy to host this particular initiative. And I'm sure many of the people who registered could not actually attend because of some reasons. Please do share that. The whole presentation is there in the YouTube. You can just go to youtube.com/SanMed Healthcare, and not only this particular today's program, but the entire 17 odd webinars we have done so far, with all the topics I discussed in the beginning of the program, is available there. All speakers, their presentations are there. So please do visit our YouTube site, youtube.com/SanMed Healthcare, right, /SanMed Healthcare. Thank you very much once again, all of you, for taking time out and being part of it. I keep saying that please do pass on to more of your colleagues, because we have the next week another presentation which is coming out, which is going to be by Dr. R. Sukanya from Bangalore, and she's going to talk about the vaccines. All the details about the vaccine would be discussed in the next one. And then July 6th we have the panel discussion where Dr. Ranganathan Iyer is going to moderate the whole session. So it's going to be a wonderful session, the coming two also, as we had the last three. And finally, I want to thank Dr. Ranga for giving the idea about this particular webinar series, and Dr. Ranganathan Iyer for stitching it so beautifully and making this happen. Thank you all. Thank you very much on behalf of.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.